Just second, sir.
Yeah. You tell me when I should start, then I will start.
You can start now, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Before I start this presentation, this talk on the Harappa culture in Gujarat, what I'm going to present is a recent perspective. I would actually like to thank ICHR Western Regional Center, Pune, uh, uh, inviting me for this presentation, especially Dr. Rajani Arora, Jyotsna Arora, I'm really sorry, Jyotsna Arora, the Deputy Director of ICHR Western Regional Center, and also Dr. Jamketkar, the Chairman of ICHR, and Dr. Nilesh Yadav, Coordinator for the Western Regional Center for this program. Um, as I said in the beginning, I would actually be talking about the Indus civilization in Gujarat and the recent perspective. Okay. So we all know that Gujarat actually forms the southern frontier of Indus civilization. Um, um, there are more than 750 sites belong to Indus civilization. In fact, discovered from Gujarat of one of the very recent surveys actually indicate more than 750 sites. These sites essentially belong to different periods of Indus civilization, belong to the early stages, what we call the pre-urban Harappan, or belong to the urban phase, or to the post-urban or the late Harappan. So it actually covers a time span starting from 3600 BC to almost 1300 BC. What I would actually focus here, in fact, is the the recent perspectives which actually kind of emerged in the last 40 years of investigation in the Harappan archaeology of Gujarat. Um, in order to do that, I will actually kind of go to the history of discovery of Indus civilization in Gujarat. What you can actually see in the map, Rangpur. Um, the extension of Indus civilization into Gujarat was actually kind of discovered as soon after the momentous discoveries of Indus civilization in the Valley of Indus happened in the 1920s. It is in 1930s the Harappan-like remains were actually kind of noticed from Rangpur, a site which is located not very far away from Lothal, a site which most of you are quite familiar with. Um, so what actually had happened, in fact, was the ruler of that region. The Rangpur actually falls into Limdi Taluk. Today it falls in Limdi Taluka. It was in fact a small princely state. The ruler of that princely state actually kind of noticed this the Harappan-like material coming from an ancient mound. There was a village which is actually sitting on top of this mound, and he actually found some similarities of that material with what has been actually reported from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the 1920s. And he therefore invited Madhav Swarup Vats to come and kind of examine those remains to understand and ascertain whether it really belonged to the Indus civilization or not. And the first excavation actually started in 1933 by Madhav Swarup Vats, who actually was excavating Harappa at that time. His excavation kind of established the southward extension of the Harappa culture. He had no problem in identifying those remains which he excavated from Rangpur belonged to Indus civilization. He actually thought it could be slightly later in time. There are certain deviant features he could actually observe. But nonetheless, he actually thought it would actually belong to Indus civilization. This actually attracted a lot of attention, world attention, in fact. That is what actually brought G.S. Gure of Asiatic Society Bombay. He kind of re-excavated the site almost 3 years later, that is in 1936. And he kind of confirms Watt's observations about its Harappan affiliation. Um, Almost a decade later, M.G. Dixit of the Deccan College once again re-excavated the site, Renpur. And in his excavation, he actually found many of the material which he excavated are actually not agreeing with what has been actually reported from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. There were some similarities, but at the same time, a lot of differences as well. He therefore actually proposed it could actually be post-Harappan rather than belong to the Indus civilization. So therefore, some amount of doubt which was actually cast in 1940s, in the late 1940s, by M.G. Dixit. So it is in this context we need to actually understand how Renpur actually become an extremely important site for understanding the southward spread of Indus civilization. In fact, for a long period of time, Renpur in fact was the only site which actually is located outside the Indus Valley proper. The other site is Kotla Nihang Khan in Punjab, which was actually discovered in 1939. But then in 1947, after the independence, when both the major Harappan sites were actually become part of the newly formed Pakistan, the Indian archaeologists, both in the Archaeological Survey of India and also from the universities, made a concerted effort to understand the extension of Indus civilization towards the east and also towards the south. This is what actually led to a spreads of exploratory surveys as well as excavations that resulted into discovery of several sites in Gujarat, as well as in the Ghaggar Saraswati system in Haryana, eastern Punjab and Haryana, and northern part of Rajasthan. Rao in 1947, Rao, in fact, as a Rao working at the Archaeological Survey of India, he was the one who actually kind of spearheaded the exploratory survey and also the excavations, that subsequent excavations in Gujarat in the 1950s. When Rao came in search of the Harappans in Gujarat, his primary objective, in fact, was to kind of confirm or reject, the Harappan affiliation of the materials which are excavated from Rangpur. So he promptly went down to excavate Rangpur once again. Before that, he actually did conduct a survey, exploratory survey that covered different parts of Gujarat, the North Gujarat, Kachchh, Saurashtra, as well as South Gujarat. The result was that he was actually able to locate a large number of new sites in all these regions. And then he started excavation at Rangpur in the mid 1950s, and subsequently he kind of excavated Lothal. And as one can observe, that this in fact was that resulted into the establishment of southern spread of the Indus civilization into Gujarat on a firmer footing, Rao's. What Rao actually kind of, while he was actually kind of excavating Rangpur, he also carried out excavation. He also started excavations at Lothal, which was a site which is located nearby, much larger site, and that actually resulted into the discovery of the classical Harappan features of the Indus civilization in Gujarat, wherein he actually come across a large urban center with the interesting architectural remains, including a large water tank, which he actually kind of identified as a dockyard. These were the discoveries which actually kind of resulted into the firm establishment of Indus civilization in Gujarat. So this is the large tank which Rao could actually kind of excavate at Lothal. As I said, this is what led to his identification as a dockyard, wherein he actually kind of were actually able to he was actually able to kind of articulate the Harappan maritime activity, wherein on the basis of material remains, which he actually come across the society, especially he did come across a Persian Gulf seal from Lothal, suggesting the trade relations of Indus sites with the contemporary Chalcolithic Persian Gulf sites, especially Oman and that region. So this is where Lothal is actually located, Gujarat, and these are the contemporary Chalcolithic site in that region, and the seals, Persian Gulf seals are actually reported from Lothal as well as from these side. That kind of established the seafaring activities of the Harappan. This was also kind of supported by the discovery as a blacksmith jar, which is generally identified as a pottery, which is primarily used for maritime activities by the Harappans. So, yes. Okay. So, the major achievements of Rao, in fact, was he was actually able to confirm the Harappan expansion into Gujarat. He established a cultural sequence. This is primarily on the basis of excavations at Rangpur. In fact, he was the first archaeologist who could actually kind of illustrate a gradual evolution of Indus civilization in Gujarat. He actually kind of proposed a fourfold sequence in the cultural development, which is now actually described as the Rangpur period, second A, second B, second C, and third. These are all different sequential periods in the cultural development of Harappan settlements in Gujarat. This is based on stratigraphic evidence as well as the cultural material, which are actually found in association with those strata. As soon as this was actually kind of published, this was severely criticized by several archaeologists of that time. In spite of that criticism, many of these are actually later found to be not based on very sound logic. But in any case, in spite of that criticism, that sequence actually stands true even today. I suppose most of researchers in Harappa culture in Gujarat essentially follow the sequence which is originally proposed by Rao. He also confirms the maritime activities of the Harappans. Earlier there were kind of speculations about how exactly they would have carried out this maritime activity by the Harappans. But its discovery of the seals and other materials from Persian Gulf, contemporary Persian Gulf Chalcolithic settlements actually kind of confirmed the maritime activities of the Harappans. And his observations about the distribution of sites along the Saurashtra coast helped him to propose a sea route for the Harappan expansion into Gujarat. He actually kind of educated that Harappans from the Indus Valley probably may have taken a sea route for coming into Gujarat, which of course was actually found to be not necessarily true. They also did take land route. That's what later studies actually kind of indicated. But then, more importantly, the most important contribution, in fact, of Rao in terms of the development of Harappan cultural research in Gujarat, in fact, was it actually started an economic protection model for the urban growth and expansion of the civilization into Gujarat. What you actually can see is that many of these sites, Lothal itself is actually seen as a craft production center, which actually kind of helped the economic setup of the Indus civilization, especially the urban phase of the Indus civilization. The later studies actually were all following this particular, what we call the urban economic production model. We'll come to that aspect a little later. So one needs to see the Harappan cultural studies, Harappan research in Gujarat in the light of these. This was in fact the major concerns till 1960s. From 1960s to 1970s, what actually follows, in fact, is more surveys that were actually carried out by Archaeological Survey of India, state archaeology departments, as well as the universities. What it resulted, in fact, was the discovery of several more sites in Saurashtra, North Gujarat, and Kachch. Today, we know that there are more than 750 Harappan sites in Gujarat. And majority of these sites, in fact, are small settlements. The size may range, sometimes on an average 2 to 3 hectares, many times less than 100 hectares. There are but a few large urban centers like Dholavira and Lothal. And then you also have a slightly smaller township kind of settlements, which like Shikarpur or Bagasra or Kirsara, Khanmer, Surkotada, etc. So you actually come across a network of settlements, following a hierarchical gradation, starting from the large urban centers and the small townships, and then the lot of rural village settlement. This, in fact, is the composition of Harappan settlements, of all these 750 settlements which we actually come across in Gujarat. You also need to remember that these sites actually belong to different time periods. You have the pre-urban phase, which are actually represented by very few sites. It is in the urban phase, that is from 2600 BC to 1900 BC, you actually do come across large number of sites. And then you have the late Harappan or the post-urban phase, starting from 1900 BC to 1300 BC or so. The number of sites, there are a quite large number of sites, but certainly not as much as that of the urban phase. So it is in this context we also need to understand that the later excavations that were actually carried out soon after the discovery of several new sites in Saurashtra, Kachch, and North Gujarat. One of the sites which are actually excavated in the 1970s, in fact, was Surkotada. By J.P. Joshi, that is in the 1970s. He was actually able to kind of propose what we call a land route through, Lower Sindh to Kachch and then entering into Saurashtra. So he therefore actually kind of added a new dimension into what is known as the Harappan expansion into Gujarat. Subsequent to that, the major excavation in the 1980s was Dholavira by Dr. Bist of the Archaeological Survey of India, which kind of brought to light one of the largest urban centers of Indus civilization in Kachch, in Gujarat. And then which kind of very firmly established all the major features of Indus civilization and the southward extension of the culture into Gujarat. Now, I mean, all these studies, be it excavations carried out at Surkotada or at Dholavira, or there are many other excavations like Khanmer or Shikarpur, Bagasra, or the excavations at Kirsara, that is in Kachch, or at Junikuran, that's also in Kachch. All these sites were primarily following what Rao has already, Rao's model of what we call the economic production model. And the main thrust of all these studies were understanding the Harappan economic production. Okay, so hence they were essentially focusing on questions such as what prompted Harappans to actually kind of extend from the Indus Valley toward the south or east. I mean, especially in the case of Gujarat, toward the south. And then how did the Harappan kind of harness the raw material resources, new resources which are actually available? It is essentially because of the availability of raw materials for craft production and other activities of the Harappan economic production that actually prompted Harappan. So that actually was the driving force for the Harappan expansion. That's the way it was actually kind of perceived by the researchers. And also, how was the craft production managed? Managing the craft production in many of these urban centers, in fact, was the major concern. Understanding how they actually managed it, where one of the major concerns of many of these researchers, including many of the excavations, were actually carried out for this purpose. And also how efficient was the technology of production, and also the distribution. So especially how these were actually distributed, exchanged, traded, etc. These were all the concerns and questions which even today, I suppose, these are the main concerns. But these were the main theme or main thrust of research in the 1970s onwards. So what prompted the southward extension, as I actually mentioned, in the initial stages, Harappans primarily were actually kind of exploring the new pastoral lands. Harappans actually did have two components in their economic production. One is what we call the agricultural component, the other is the craft production component. So in the agricultural production, they need to have new pastoral lands added into their expanding cattle or the herd population, both cattle, sheep, and goat. And this is what would have actually kind of prompted Harappans to move toward the east as well as toward the south into Gujarat in due course of time. And the other motivation, other kind of attraction would have been the availability of raw material. The Harappans, in fact, are actually known for their craft items, consumable craft items which are produced from shell bangles, other items of items which are made of shell, and also lapidary, semi-precious stone, beads, and other ornaments. Okay. These raw materials for the production of shell bangles or shell items, as well as for the semi-precious stones, were mostly available in Gujarat. And you can actually see the Harappan shell objects were actually produced by marine gastropods. Those who are, and these gastropods are actually found to be distributed along the Arabian coast of Gujarat. So you do actually come across several coastal sites actually catering into the craft activities related to the shell production of shell items. And then these are all some of the places where you actually come across semi-precious stone raw material source areas in Kachchh as well as in southern part of Gujarat, South Gujarat. Like again, carnelian, jasper, these sources are actually found mostly in Gujarat. This is what most probably brought the Harappans into Gujarat. So quite natural. It's quite natural that you do come across many of the sites in Gujarat Harappan sites actually catering into the production of these craft items, and evidence of which could actually be seen in many of the sites in Gujarat. So what one can actually see is the Dholavira and Lothal, in fact, were the two large urban centers which actually came up on the basis of this craft production. You do come across copious evidence of craft production at Dholavira, and also equally important was Lothal. There also you come across good amount of evidence regarding craft production. This includes shell bangle production, bead production, pottery, copper, making copper implements, etc. Okay. These are our large centers at Dholavira and Lothal. You also have smaller centers like Shikarpur or Bagasura or Nageshwar. You can see these were actually making both items made of shell as well as the beads made of semi-precious stones. And these sets of evidence are also found from Kanmer or from Surkotada, Kirsara, and other places as well, suggesting that many of these sites were actually involved in the production of these craft items, which actually was the mainstay of urban Harappan economic production. Even the smaller settlements like Nagwada, which is a small rural settlement, also had shown enough evidence of some amount of craft production, suggesting that they also became part and parcel of this larger network of Harappan economic protection system. All right. So I will actually show some interesting evidence which we have excavated from Bagasra. This is a map which actually shows Bagasra, which is actually located, as you can actually see, this is located very close to the Gulf of Kachchh, just at on the shore of this Gulf. What we have is a small urban Harappan settlements wherein you actually come across evidence of craft protection of producing beads, bangles made of shell, fanes, pottery, copper working, etc. What you also see is that many of these large-scale production is actually found within a fortified part of the settlements. And you also do come across evidence of household production outside, which in fact are small scale. So this also suggests how important it was for the Harappans to kind of safeguard the craft production, that actually kind of helped them to kind of sustain their economic value of those craft items. Also kind of preserve the technology. That is one way of actually kind of sustaining the economic value of your craft products. Such evidence are actually unearthed from other larger centers like Dholavira or Lothal, or also from smaller centers like Kanmer, where you have actually evidence of fanes working as well as production of pottery and beads, and also from Kirsara, which is also in Kachchh. This is one of the interesting workshop which we have excavated from Bagasra, a shell workshop where you can actually see raw shell. This is the Tubinella pyrum, one of the marine gastropod, which was actually kind of used by the Harappans for making mostly bangles. There were other two more varieties of shell, like Chicorius ramosus, which were actually used for producing, spoons or ladles and other items. So you can see this cut shell circlets. Something around about close to 300 of them that actually kind of, I guess, stored in this workshop for the further polishing. So this appears to be a kind of workshop where the craftsmen actually kind of carried out their shell working activity at Bagasra. You might actually come across similar kind of evidence from Nageshwar, which is also located on the coastal regions of Saurashtra, and also from many other sites like Lothal. But in this case, it is kind of much better preserved. We also have evidence of other craft production activities, like this one actually shows the production of fanes. These are all actually located quite nearby. This is where most probably the fanes production activity must have been carried out by the Harappans at Bagasra. And by the side of it, you also come across the stone bead production, wherein you come across a large number of silos. Many of them were actually found filled with chunks of raw material. These were actually eventually used for production of the beads. So that is what you can actually see in this slide, where a stockpile of a particular kind of rock, a very rare kind of rock, which was found in Saurashtra, especially in Jamnagar. This was actually kind of stockpiled, essentially suggesting the kind of they probably kind of controlled their production so that they can actually enhance the value, commercial value of it, probably. So you come across beads at different stages of production at the site, indicating mass production of these beads at those sites. So many of the sites in Gujarat actually show these kind of crack production activity. So what you can actually see is that these were all essentially, all these studies were essentially following the original model which Rao had kind of followed, that is Harappan economic production, and even today we actually follow this in order to understand how exactly the Harappans kind of sustained the economic activities, economic production for almost 600 or 700 years during the urban phase of Indus Valley civilization. Now, in the 1980s, while this was actually happening on late 60s and 70s onwards, in the 1980s, there was a major shift in the Harappan studies, especially in Gujarat. This actually resulted into bring forth the new perspectives on regional diversity, and also it actually tried to understand the origin of the Harappa culture in Gujarat. All right. What happened in the 1980s, in fact, was that in 1980s you actually see larger involvement of, universities. Especially, they were actually kind of excavating or doing research on smaller sites, while the larger sites are actually kind of studied by the Archaeological Survey of India, who had the resources to actually carry out that kind of larger excavation. But the university is essentially kind of focused on smaller settlements in order to understand, what role these smaller settlements might have actually played in the Harappan economic product. That, in fact, was the original idea about taking up the smaller settlements, which are actually found in large numbers everywhere, in Kachchh, as well as in Saurashtra and North Gujarat. As I said, this was actually spearheaded by the universities. There was this MS University of Vadodara, then there was Deccan College, Pune, University of Pennsylvania, USA in collab. All these universities were actually collaborating with the Gujarat government for the studies and this is what actually resulted in the excavations of a large number of sites in the 1980s in Gujarat. And this is what also actually led to the realization of Harappan regional diversity. Till then, it has been always argued that in the civilization actually started with the urban phase of the Harappa culture, and there is not much regional diversity that existed, in the Harappan culture remains you come across in Gujarat. This was the pattern, or this was the model which was essentially followed by most of the researchers till 1980s, or yes, exactly. But then you also have to remember that if you look at the material remains you come across from Gujarat, from the Harappan sites in Gujarat, they are not exactly the same as what you actually come across in the Indus Valley proper, sites in Indus Valley proper. They do show certain diverse features, and it is these diverse features which actually made Emmett Worth, the one who actually excavated Rangpur for the first time in 1930s, to say that probably this could be later part of the Harappa culture. And this is also the same which actually kind of prompted M.G. Dixit to say that this is post-Harappan. And when B. Subbarao of MS University, when he actually kind of surveyed the Harappan material coming from Saurashtrian side, he thought there are certain differences which need to be emphasized. And then he actually described them as Kathiawar Harappan, Kathiawar being the traditional name, one of the traditional names of Saurashtra, because these sites are mostly distributed, as you see in this map with the red dots, in Saurashtra. So in Kachchh, most of the sites you come across in Kachchh, most of them, not all of them, actually show material remains which are very similar to what you come across in the Indus Valley proper. As you move into Saurashtra, there are very few sites which actually show very exactly similar features. What you come across in the Indus Valley, they actually show certain deviant regional features. That is what we are actually talking about. The classical Harappan features are actually found in very few sites like Lothal. Then you also have some features which are found at Rangpur, Bagasra, and also at Nageshwar. These are the few sites which actually show the classical Harappan features. The rest of the sites mostly they actually show the regional features. Okay, and this is what actually prompted Subbarao to actually call it Kathiawad Harappan, emphasizing it actually belonged to the Harappa culture, but showing certain regional features. But he actually thought it actually belonged to the later part of the urban phase. Primarily that is what scholars it kind of believed at that time. The Harappan cultural development, what you come across in Saurashtra, actually is later than 1900 BC. So even S.R. Rao, when he actually kind of excavated Ranpur, and he actually talks these remains as the late Harappan remains, and then dates them later than 1900 BC. Okay, this idea was to actually change after the excavations at Rojdi. Rojdi is in Rajkot district. This was actually excavated once, I suppose, in the late 1970s, but then it was re-excavated by Greg Posel and M.H. Ravel of Greg Posel of Pennsylvania University, USA, and M.H. Ravel of Gujarat State Archaeology Department in the 1980s, in the mid 1980s. So what in the excavation, what Posel and Ravel actually kind of observed in the excavation is that most of the classical Harappan artifacts are actually almost completely absent at Rojdi. What they come across is ceramic vessel forms which are different from the classical Harappan, showing their own features which can be easily periodized into the late Harappan. Okay, that is certainly later than 1900 BC, and these vessels are actually found to be, takeoff or slightly modified from the classical Harappan vessel forms. So therefore, the Harappan affiliation was not at doubt, and technologically they are actually found to be at par with the classical Harappan. They're all nicely made on wheel. You do come across some amount of beads being produced at there. You also come across some architectural remains. So in general, in technological terms, these remains are actually found to be at par with the classical Harappan. But for the first time, Posel and Ravel were actually able to get a series of radiocarbon dates for the cultural remains excavated from Rojdi. And these dates actually were bracketed from 2600 BC to 1700 BC. So then they actually realized that they're actually dealing with the cultural remains not belong to the late Harappan period, but contemporary to the urban phase of Indus civilization. This is what actually kind of helped Posel and Ravel to define the Harappan cultural diversity in Saurashtra, in Gujarat, as Surat Harappan. Surat being the, again, another, excuse me, traditional name of Saurashtra region. So the radiocarbon dates actually played a major role in actually realizing the actual contemporaneity of the cultural material from Rojdi with that of the classical or the Indus Valley, urban phase of the Indus Valley civilization. So as you can actually see it in here, that is on the here where my cursor moves. That is the classical Harappan vessel forms, and where you have at Rojdi, what you have is all these different forms which are not found in the classical Harappan ceramic assemblages at all. You have many different kinds of open-mouthed bowl, stud-handled bowl, which actually is a characteristic feature of the Harappa culture in Saurashtra. Then you also have some of these bichrome paintings, which are very rare in the case of classical Harappan, whereas not very uncommon in the Surat Harappan. You can see there are pots, different kinds of pots, also painted in that bichrome pattern. in the painting style is also entirely different. So these are all the features which helped Apostle and Ravel to kind of define the material cultural difference in the Surat between the Surat Harappan and the classical Harappans. There were also differences in the settlement features as well. You know, the classical Harappans, the meticulous planning for forming a bipatrate pattern in the city and town planning. You have the lower town, citadel, etc., which are commonly known to everyone. You do not actually come across those features very much prominent in the Surat Harappans. And most of the Surat Harappan sites, in fact, are very small. As I said, it is less than 2 hectares. Many of them are rural settlements, but you also do have some large settlements which actually show the structural features, and some of them, like the one at Pithad or Jadak or at Rojri itself, Posel did actually come across, structural remains which actually forming certain rectangular plan. As you can see it in this case, it's from a nice rectangular plan, and it also has an open court in the front, which is also kind of bound by a perimeter wall. So simulating the Harappan, town, settlement plan, but not exactly the same. There appears to be some kind of, some attempt to kind of plan the settlement by the Harappan, at least in the larger settlements. But then you also do come across difference in the way the Harappan settlements were actually Harappan dwellings, and these perimeter walls or the fortification walls were actually constructed by the Harappans. Harappans actually used, a standard sized mud brick or the burnt bricks or nicely dressed stones, even when they are actually available in their construction of the fortification or the structures. Whereas in the case of Surat Harappan, you do actually come across most of them being made of large slabs or boulders. Most of them are not really dressed or minimally dressed sometimes, and there appears to be no real use of mud bricks in the Surat Harappan settlements. Most of the settlements were actually made of wattle and daub, or made of rubble stones. But then, even more, apparent, in fact, was the kind of food items they kind of consumed. The classical Harappan crops were essentially wheat and barley. These were probably their staple food. Most of the Indus sites actually yielded evidence of cultivation of wheat as well as barley and other pulses. These are what we call the winter crops. These were actually very rarely found in the Harappan sites. What have been actually found in the Harappan sites in Gujarat, in fact, are smaller and larger millets in the later times, and local pulses, suggesting that the Surat Harappans essentially were depending upon local food grains. That, in fact, was the local the staple food. So there appears to be variation in the cuisines of the classical Harappan and Surat Harappan. So these are the features that actually became apparent in recent studies that were conducted in Surat Harappan sites in Gujarat. So, in the light of these, the Surat Harappan is actually defined by Posel and Ravel as the regional manifestation of the Harappa culture in Saurashtra, starting from the urban phase. Okay, and these are the main features of Surat Harappan as we see today: economy, which is based on pastoralism and farming. All right, and the pottery is essentially made of wheel. And you also do come across crusted guiding grid technology for the stone tool production. And there is also copious use of copper. Copper, in fact, was extensively used in Surat Harappan context. And settlements sometimes show rudimentary planning. Otherwise, it was actually quite flimsy. And in the larger settlements, probably indicate an economy tending towards surplus production. There is no actual evidence of a surplus production being the major economic norm of the Surat Harappans, it appears that they were actually moving towards a surplus production because you do come across some larger settlements with very solid fortifications and large structural remains, both dwelling as well as the perimeter walls. The next important perspective that actually emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, in fact, is our understanding about the antecedent stages of Harappa culture in Gujarat. Um, till 1980s or in the 1990s, it's been actually assumed, as I said earlier, that Indus civilization actually started in Gujarat with the urban phase. In the 1980s and 1990s, this perspective actually changed with the result of identification of a number of early regional Chalcolithic cultures in different parts of Gujarat, North Gujarat, as well as in Saurashtra, that actually predated the urban phase of Indus civilization. Okay. When I say predated, the date actually goes back to 3600 BC to almost 3600 BC. That is the time bracket in which these early Harappan Chalcolithic settlements actually may belong to. These are actually reported from North Gujarat, as you can actually see. The type site here is Loteshwar. This has been actually dated to 3600 BC. And similar kind of evidence is actually unearthed from the Bhavanagar coast of Saurashtra from Pottery. That's also dating back to 3600 BC. And a little further south in the Saurashtra coast, in Junagadh coast, Junagadh district is pre-Prabhas. That is, which has been dated to around 3000 to 3300 BC. These are all radiocarbon days. You also have another interesting site in North Gujarat, which is just adjacent to the eastern margin of Kachchh, Dathrana, which actually is an extremely interesting site, which showed the early Chalcolithic settlement going back to 3000 or 3300 BC, showing very close similarity in the material culture between the Prabhas as well as Dathrana, the pre-Prabhas. Okay, we will actually kind of very quickly deal with these early Chalcolithic cultures. What actually led to the discovery of the early, early Harappan Chalcolithic cultures in North Gujarat was the excavation that we carried out in North Gujarat in the late 1980s and 1990s. Now, North Gujarat, in fact, was actually considered to be a region which was not preferred by the Harappan agriculturalists because of its very harsh environment. No sites were actually, not many sites, just one or two sites were actually discovered, reported from that region prior to 1980s. The MS University's explorations and subsequent excavation actually led by Professor Egde and later by Professor Sonavani and others actually led to the discovery of more than 120 sites belong to different phases of Indus civilization here. It is in that context the early Harappan sites from this region was actually discovered. The excavations which actually produce concrete evidence of this early Harappan is the site is actually located at Loteshwar, where Loteshwar here, as you can see, which actually yielded a completely different cultural material from the Harappans, which has been actually dated to 3600 to 3700 BC. And then similar materials are actually reported from Dathrana as well as from Nagwada. So this is the site at Loteshwar, which is actually located on a sand dune. This is the environmental setting you actually come across most of the sites in North Gujarat. Most of them are actually located on top of a sand dune. and the interregional depressions, which actually kind of provided the necessary, source of water for those, agro-pastoral settlements to actually survive in this very harsh environment. This is the excavations at Tatrana, at Loteshwar. What you come across here, in fact, is the Chalcolithic remains, which are actually quite flimsy, around 50 centimeters, not more than that. But then they are also found to be a large number of pits belong to that Chalcolithic period, which has actually been dated. These remains actually coming from the Chalcolithic, which has been dated to 3600 to 3700 BC. And preceding to this is the Mesolithic or the Microlithic based hunter-gatherer communities, which has been dated to around 7000 BC. Okay, so what you come across here is these are the ceramic assemblages which are actually found from, found from Loteshwar. These assemblages has been named as Anartha being the traditional name of North Gujarat. Okay, as you can see, these are actually different, entirely different from the classical Harappan potteries. First of all, they are all handmade or turntable made, and they do have a shape which is distinctly different from the classical Harappan shape. And then they are also many times painted in white or bichrome colors, which is not so very common in the case of urban face, which are actually not uncommon in the early Harappan stage. And these are actually dominated by the bowls, as you can actually see here, many different kinds of bowls with the characteristic paintings, and these kind of small or medium-sized pots with the very interesting bichrome paintings. These are the assemblages which you actually come across at Anartha or the North Gujarat early Chalcolithic assemblages. That's a line drawing of those potteries, which you can actually see. They have this very characteristic feature, which is not actually found repeated in any of the classical Harappan sites or any other regional Chalcolithic cultures. You actually come across, this is the Surat Harappan words. You can actually kind of similarity in this. Probably they actually resemble, probably suggesting that the antecedent stages of the Surat Harappan should actually be seen. Surat Harappan has been dated from 2500 BC to 1900 BC, whereas the Anartha has been dated from 3600 to 300 BC, but it actually continues along with the Urban Harappan. So what you can actually see is that if one has to actually look at the antecedent stages of Surat Harappan, which we haven't come across so far in Saurashtra, probably we should actually look at the early Chalcolithic cultures, which actually shows a lot of similarities in their vessel forms and also in settlement patterns, settlement features. Now, what you also see is that all these early settlements, be it Loteshwar or Datrana, or at Vaharvotimbo, that is another site in North Gujarat which we had excavated, all these have actually produced evidence of exploitation of local millets, small millets, not the large millets, small millets, including sesame, both wild sesame as well as later the domesticated forms of sesames. And you also have local pulses like the host gram or Microthalama uniflorum, etc., which has been actually kind of exploited by this local community. So what you can actually see is that these early Chalcolithic farmers, essentially depending upon locally available food grains, not necessarily depending upon wheat and barley. Wheat and barley were not actually found in the early stages. You come across the earliest evidence of wheat and barley from a 3,300 contest from Datrana in association with the early Harappans of the Indus Valley. So apart from that, the cultural material which is associated with this early Chalcolithic communities, in fact, as you do come across some amount of beads which are made on carnelian, as well as Amazonite, shell, and also terracotta, And yeah, these are some of those cultural material like pottery disc or spinning wool probably, and these reeds with clay lumps with reed impression, probably suggesting wetland kind of structures. You also do come across at this site at Loteshwar a large number of pits. These pits must have been actually used for storage purpose. We have actually kind of carried out kind of a study of residues which are found at the bottom of this pit. They are actually found to be containing a lot of enriched phytoliths, probably suggesting the pits must have been actually used for storage of temporary storage of grains by these early Chalcolithic communities. We also do come across some interesting cultural material dealing with the human figures from this assemblage, the Anartha or the North Gujarat. You can see that this is very minimalistic kind of depiction of human figures. In this case, you can see a female figure with pinch technique being used, sometimes also kind of applique, where in here yeah, the breast is actually shown by applique kind of technique, and then you can see the eyes and the mouth and the ears are actually shown by kind of putting small little beads in that position. And in this case, what you can say, the articulation or the way the two figures are actually kind of molded looks very similar, but then the decoration actually looked different. You can actually see little pin pricks in order to show the features, as well as it is actually used as a decorative style for this what you call for this figurine. But interestingly enough, similar kind of figurines are actually reported from the northern part of Punjab in Pakistan. Sites in the Banu Basin, Sarai Khan, Tekri, and other sites, which you can see in this illustration. There are a lot of very interesting similarities between these figures which are actually found. And such similarities can also be found the decorations which you come across in the Anartha pottery and the early Ravi phase pottery, or the pottery which you come across at these sites, suggesting that there appears to be some kind of relationship that existed between these regions. How exactly this can be explained, one does not really know. There appears to be some similarity. That is all at the moment one can actually say. Now, similar assemblages has actually been reported. Early Chalcolithic assemblage going back to 3600 BC has been reported from the Saurashtra coast at Padri, as I actually mentioned at the beginning. This is a site which has been excavated by Professor Bashan Chinde of the Deccan College and his team in the 1970s. In the earliest of the cultural remains, they actually come across an assemblage that is predominated by what is known as peculiar kind of pottery, which has been designated as Padri ware, which is also kind of handmade or made on turntable, showing decorative features which are very different from the Harappan. They actually show some similarity with the kind of pottery which we come across in North Gujarat, Anartha sites. They did also come across some evidence of structures at the site which are actually built of dark packed clay. And there are also evidence of use of copper and lithic implements, and lithic implements were produced by crusted guiding grid technology. And these are some of the potteries which you actually can see reported from that site. So some similarity in this pottery as well as that of the Anartha has been actually kind of suggested by the researchers. And Padri has been actually dated, as you can see, 3680 BC to 3000 BC. So almost contemporary with the kind of early Chalcolithic settlements in North Gujarat. So what it actually suggests is that there appears to be quite widespread, expansion of this early Chalcolithic settlements in this region. So, and the sites of these spirit or this character, in fact, are actually found spread in the Satrunji basin of Bhavnagar district. Now, that is where Padri is actually located. Now, further south of Padri is Priprabhat. This in fact is slightly later in time than Padri and Anartha. This in fact was the first site which actually indicated the presence of a non-Harappan material in this region. This was actually kind of noticed by B. Subbarao in the 1950s, but then it was actually kind of affirmed in the 1970s by Dholavira. And this has been actually dated to around 3000 BC. Okay, so we'll come to that. So this pre-Prabhas assemblage of the Prabhas pattern. It is in the 1950s. This was actually discovered. Subbarao actually described this the ceramic assemblages which we now associate pre-Prabhas, a part and parcel of the Prabhas assemblages which he came across in the excavation. It is Dhaulika's excavation in 1971 which actually were able to kind of find a separate substratum exclusively of the pre-Prabhas pottery. And this has been actually dated to 2963 BC, 2963 BC. Now, in 1971, not much attention was actually given to this early date, thought that the dates could be wrong, or maybe because of contamination, it is actually giving an early date. That's primarily because researchers, scholars were actually kind of conditioned by the idea that Indus civilization actually kind of started only by the beginning of the urban phase, that is around 2500 or 2600 BC, not earlier than that. But anyway, what actually emerged is that this pre-Prabhas is actually made up of a totally different set of vessel forms, which are not actually found not in North Gujarat, not in Anartha or at Padri. Even though Padri and Somnath, pre-Prabhas pottery site, Somnath or pre-Prabhas are located geographically closer. We don't come across similar pottery at pre-Prabhas pottery at Padri. So these are the vessels which you actually come across at the site. You have red ware, grey ware with open-mouthed vessels, also a black and red ware. Black inside and showing very peculiar kinds of incised decoration, both inside as well as outside. Also flat-based vessels, basins, pods, these kinds of large open-mouthed pods, basins, etc. But then in the excavations, he also did come across some Harappan-like pottery. The difference is that these vessels were all made of either handmade or turntable made, whereas the Harappan-like pottery was actually made on fast wheel. So the distinction is not very difficult to actually make. And there were also blades, which will lithic blades actually showing crested guiding techniques, and also some beads reported from these sides. Now, similar site, were actually found from Datrana, which is actually located in the northern part of Gujarat, very close to the edge, the western edge of North Gujarat here. And these two sites are actually separated by, as you can actually see, almost 500 kilometers. There are no sites of similar nature actually found in between, but yet the material. This is the site at Datrana, and that is the excavations at Datrana, and as in the case of most of the Chalcolithic sites, early Chalcolithic sites in North Gujarat, the cultural material is very, very little, generally around 50 centimeters or less than 50 centimeters. But then this actually even though it is very little, it actually provided an interesting evidence of Chalcolithic material, and this has been actually dated to 3300 BC, and that actually contained the pre-Prabhas pottery. This is This is the pre-Prabhas pottery, which is actually found from Datrana. Along with these, and this is very exactly similar to what has been reported from Somnath or Prabhas Patan in the Saurashtra coast. And along with that, you also do come across a lot of beads being evidence of bead production, as well as a large number of blades being actually produced, and these blades were actually produced by crusted guiding technique, and this has been actually dated to 3,300 BC. So what that is the third important early Chalcolithic assemblage which we come across in Gujarat. So if you actually kind of summarize the character of the early Chalcolithic regional cultures of this region, what one can say is that they are all rural agro-pastoral settlements based on animal herding and farming. Potteries are generally handmade, no evidence of fast wheel in this context, and no crusted guiding ridge except in the case of pre-Prabhas. Pre-Prabhas does actually show crusted guiding technique. And then you have copper implements. So that's why they are essentially chalcolithic in nature and flimsy structures. These, in fact, are and also sometimes large pits, which essentially meant for, I think, a storage purpose from Lotesa. These, in fact, are the primary character of the early Chalcolithic cultures of this region. Now, this will be the last part of it, in the sense that we actually do come across another interesting set of evidence, which actually indicate the interaction of Gujarat with the early Harappan settlements in the Sindh region. You know, in the evidence which we discussed till now has been actually kind of talking about the indigenous early Chalcolithic settlements, which you come across in Gujarat, in North Gujarat and Saurashtra. Whereas this one actually talks about the evidence of the expansion of the early Chalcolithic, early Harappan settlements, which you come across in the Indus into Saurashtra, into Gujarat, Kachchh and North Gujarat. Most of this evidence are actually coming from North Gujarat and Kachchh, and these were initially identified on the basis of a series of burials which are discovered in North Gujarat in the late 1980s and 1990s. And this was actually kind of confirmed by the discovery of more such burials on the early Harappan material found from Kachchh of late, very recently. So this you can actually see that is the early Harappan sites in Indus region, and then these red dots what you see here, these are the sites which actually show this early Harappan presence in North Gujarat and Kachchh. As I said, most of these actually come from the series of burials, and also there are some evidence of multiply, as you see in here. That site is a habitational site. Datrana is again Datrana here is another habitational site. So let's quickly look at what are the kind of evidence which we have to kind of illustrate this interaction between Gujarat and the Indus Valley during the early Harappan times. This is one of those burials excavated from Yerwada, which is actually located on the eastern margin of the little town of Kachchh in Patan district today. You can see these are pit burials containing a series of pots which are actually kept. No skeletons were actually found in this particular kind of burial type. There are also burials having skeletons found from North Gujarat sites, like Santli and other sites. You actually have more than 10 sites showing these kind of features in North Gujarat alone. And then you have equal number of sites which are now reported from Kachchh. And this, in fact, are the kind of pottery which we had actually collected from those burials. They showing what we describe as the early Harappan pottery that shows close similarity with the potteries that are found from the Indus Valley sites, early Harappan Indus Valley sites, especially in the middle Indus and the lower Indus. Okay, Now, what is also interesting is that similar kind of pottery is also found from Datrana, which the site which you had just seen, which actually has pre-prepared assemblages. And these are the pottery, I mean, very fragmentary, but one cannot actually miss that similarity of this pottery with the early Harappan pottery, which you come across in the burials, as well as the pottery which you come across in the early Harappan sites in the Indus Valley region. Okay, and you can also see from the interaction, conclusive evidence for this interaction between the Indus Valley and Gujarat in the form of this rohri chert blade, which is actually found from Datrana. It is obvious that this the raw material for this production actually comes from Sukar rohri that is in the Middle Indus. So it firmly establishes the interaction of the early Harappan communities of Indus with the early Chalcolithic communities of North Gujarat or Kachchh. So, and interestingly, it is in here you actually come across the earliest evidence of cluster guiding technology being practiced for the mass production of blades in Gujarat, and also come across evidence of the early Harappan beads, as you can see, made not by very sophisticated technology of the Harappans, kind of very crude technology being used for making this with this crude beads, going back as early as 3300 BC. So that kind of is the supporting evidence for understanding the interaction that existed between the early Harappans of Indus region as well as the early Chalcolithic communities of North Gujarat. So these are these blue dots essentially actually shows the newly discovered burial sites or the early Harappan sites showing. Most of these are actually showing burials. That is also interesting. Why only burials? That's a question one can always actually ask, and there are no satisfying answer yet at the moment. It's a real challenge for the Harappan archaeologists in Gujarat. How do we actually kind of explain this interesting phenomena? But anyway, so these are the sites which we have actually discussed, showing early Harappan features, Nagwada, Vaharbu, and some excavated sites. There are more than 10 sites in this region. In fact, the first evidence of the burials actually showing early Harappan affiliation was actually noticed by J.P. Joshi when he excavated Surkotada in the 1970s. He illustrated the pottery found from those burials, and these burials, in fact, were actually kind of pit burials covered with a capstone. And he found this pottery are actually more closer to early Harappans reported from Indus region than what has been found in the Harappan levels at Surkotada and other sites in Gujarat. And in our subsequent explorations, we actually come across several sites like Daneti, Mathal, and also Juni Khatia. That is a site which is now actually discovered by Dr. S.V. Rajesh of Trivandrum, Kerala University. His excavation at the site is actually kind of ongoing. But the site was the first site of this nature was actually kind of reported from Daneti, and then it was actually excavated subsequently by the team from the MS University. I will just briefly show that and then complete my presentation. So this is Daneti, which is actually, as you can see, it is not very far away from Bhuj, just 20 kilometers south of Bhuj, located, 20 kilometers, I think, south of Bhuj, yes. Yes, this is the plan of the site at Daneti, which you can see. This appears to be a burial site. No habitation site, no evidence of habitation, regular habitation could actually be found anywhere at the site or in the surrounding 6 to 10 kilometer area, or anywhere else. There is no any evidence of an early Harappan settlement or a major Harappan settlement in the vicinity. But yet you have a large, almost 4.5 hectare site. There are more than 46 graves which we could actually kind of count on the basis of the surface indications. Many of them have actually been destroyed by the local treasure hunters. And then we actually did kind of excavated a few in the last 3 years. And this is how the site may look like. There is no clear indication of any burials here, but you can actually see some stone circle where my cursor actually move, or I can actually show them. Yeah, this actually form a kind of circle. If you train your eye, you can actually see such circles, such patterns forming a circle all over this, what you call the open space, open flat space, and they are an indication of the presence of a burial underneath. And you can actually see they forming many times forming a circle, a stone circle, sometimes like forming a ring, etc. And when you actually excavate, most of them are actually found to have covered with a capstone, large slabs being actually used to cover this burial, very large. These burials are almost 3 to 5 meters long, and then they contain skeleton. Many of them are actually extended inhumation burials and contains a lot of pottery. Or sometimes, there are many different kinds of burials in here, forming a kind of stone circle in this case, a large circle, kind circle, or stone circle. At the center, you have this the burial with a capstone. Some of them actually kind of collapsing down in the burial pit. This is huge. It actually measures around 15 meters across. It's around 11 or 12 meters, and this is 15 meters. So it's a huge, large structure. And yeah, this is an extended inhumation burial. You can see the skeleton here, and the potteries are generally kind of stacked at the at the foot side, at the feet side, as you can actually see. And the number actually varies from, in our excavation, we found 19 to 54. 19 is the smallest, I suppose, and the largest, I suppose, is around 54. And then you do also come across generally two pots, which are actually kept at the head side as well. Not only on the leg side, but also on the head side. But most of the potteries are actually found to be stacked at the leg side. And yeah, this one, you can see this one contains 33 pots, dishes, basins, dish on stands, different kinds of small and large globular pots, all of them actually showing mostly early Harappan features. And the only other thing which these burials actually contain is shell bangles and shell items, including some beads which are actually collected from the surface, means shell beads, not stone beads. This is one of those burials. Very rarely they actually contain these other ornaments apart from pottery, but these actually contain 12 shell bangles. A similar kind of evidence has been actually now excavated from Juni Khatia by Dr. Rajesh. So what you can actually see, these are the potteries which are actually collected from those burials, which shows a very close similarity with the potteries which we have come across from North Gujarat early Harappan burials, showing that they all actually belong to the same cultural phase or cultural affiliation. You also have this dish on stand showing some kind of reserved slip technique in the decoration. As you can actually see, these are not the classical reserved slipware, but then technique actually shows that particular way of decorating the pottery, which is very peculiar to this early Harappan burial pottery. Now, as I actually mentioned, there are more than 10 sites of this category which has been actually now reported from Kachch. Two sites have actually been excavated. One is Daneti, that is excavated by our team. And the second site, which is under excavation, is Juni Khatia by Dr. Rajesh of Kerala University. And this, I suppose, is one of the interesting set of evidence which we have for understanding the role of early Harappans and what in fact was the contribution of the early Harappans in the cultural development of the Chalcolithic as well as the Harappan culture in Gujarat. Okay, so to summarize, what in fact are the result of this early Harappan interaction. Um, it actually helped to help the transfer and spread of better technologies. When the local early Chalcolithic communities, when you actually compare that with the early Harappans of Indus region, they were technologically much more advanced in the sense that they were actually using wheel-made pottery. They were also using crusted guiding technology for lithic artifacts production, and they probably have been more adept in agricultural activities. So what you see is that so the interaction actually helped in the spread of better technologies in pottery production. That is the introduction of wheel, and which actually spreads in due course of time, and lithic technology, that is the crusted guiding technology, extensively used later by the Harappans across Gujarat, and then enhancement of farming, where the new technology is being actually adopted for farming activities. So that helped the enhancement of agricultural production, and also craft production, bead production, etc. And this actually formed the sound base for the emergence of the Harappan urbanism in Gujarat. So in nutshell, the early Harappan interaction actually played the formative role, or the base for the emergence of urban features in Gujarat. So the Harappan or the Chalcolithic cultural pattern which we come across in Gujarat actually integrate all these factors. This is what one should actually understand. Whatever features which we actually observe in different regions, including in Saurashtra or Kachchh or North Gujarat, essentially is an integration of these technologies that are actually coming from the indigenous source, as well as the source which is essentially coming from the Indus Valley. That's the way one can actually kind of appreciate the cultural development of the Harappans in Gujarat in general. I would end this talk with that comment, and would like to acknowledge my indebtedness to all those who are actually involved in the study, especially Archaeological Survey of India and Gujarat government, those who actually kind of granted permission, and also many a times kind of supported our excavations and exploration programs through the providing proper financial grants. And North Gujarat Archaeology project and Indus project, which of the RIN in Japan. These actually help to kind of study the early Chalcolithic communities of North Gujarat, very specifically about understanding how food production actually the early Chalcolithic communities' economic production, especially the farming activities, actually kind of managed. These were the areas which the No Gap as well as the Indus project kind of made an impact in our research. And the University of Wisconsin, USA, especially Professor Mark Noyer, who kind of supported our research activities both in North Gujarat as well as in other sites like Bagasra or Shikarpur. And finally, ICHR Western Region Center Pune, Dr. Jyotsna Arora and Dr. Jamdetha for inviting me for this lecture, and Dr. Nilesh Yadav of the for Deccan College for coordinating this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Can stop recording?
Yes, sir.
I suppose it is too long.